Chapter 5. In Sochi, we had rooms in the best hotels, with windows opening on the Black Sea. Before supper, washed and dressed in our best clothes, we gathered in the drawing room of the hotel where Mr. Gurdjieff was staying. Pointing to the piano, he asked my wife to sing the Bell Song from Lakme, as if she had not just finished a 2-month walk. It was in these pleasant surroundings that we ate an excellent supper, altogether a complete contrast to the privations we had endured for so long. But as we left the dining room, thinking of hours of sleep in bed, Mr. Gurdjieff said, Thomas Alexandrovitch, which he called me on special occasions, when he wished to be formal, and which never preceded anything agreeable. Tomorrow, early, not later than 6, get up and go to the hotel on the squares. Our horses are there. Give them oats and water. So in spite of my yearning for a long, long sleep, how beautiful to sleep in a real bed, by a window opening onto the quiet moonlit sea. I had to get up and go out to the horses, with one foot in a boot and the other, owing to the festering toes, in a bedroom slipper. But the idea of fairy tales, promising that you will reach your goal only by overcoming all obstacles and difficulties, was happily so strong in me that I felt no silent protest. In spite of all apparent tiredness, when one takes the right course, one finds that inner energy increases, new force appears, and it begins to be easier to make new efforts. The next day, our horses and dog were put in a shed in front of our hotel. I continued to have the task of looking after them. Each morning, dressed in my old coat and odd footwear, 2 pails in my hands, I went to the kitchen of the hotel to get food for our animals. After having cleaned the horses, I returned with the pails to the hotel, passing among the tables where all the fashionable people, many of them acquaintances, were drinking their morning coffee. It is strange, but I was not embarrassed as I had been when I went to sell silk in Kislovodsk. After this chore, I changed my clothes while my wife prepared breakfast. Jay came and we all had tea with sugar, cornbread, and the dry Caucasian cheese we had to fry slightly in a pan. During this trip, we had become quite friendly with Jay. Mr. Gurdjieff suddenly announced that the expedition was finished. He advised us to make plans for the future, as he had no more money to support any of us. I decided at once that, whatever happened, my wife and I would not leave him, so as Mr. Gurdjieff decided to stay in Sochi for the moment, we had to organize our life there somehow. The Moscow people decided to return to Essentuki, which the White Army had now taken back from the Bolsheviks, and where 2 of them had left their mothers. Z went with them. All this was very sad, for we never saw them again. Z died from smallpox in Rostov. The others went to Maikop, where P became director of a state school. Mr. Gurdjieff asked him to come to Tiflis when we went there, but he did not come. And when the Bolsheviks again conquered the whole northern Caucasus, he returned to Moscow. Soon, even correspondence with him became impossible. After our companions left, we went around the city to find a place to live. Passing a very nice 2-story villa in a garden, my wife remarked that such a place would be perfect for us. The next morning she passed the house again, and, seeing that there was a room with a veranda available on the 2nd floor, rented the room at once. The owners were nice people, and the landlady taught my wife to cook, to iron, and to do all kinds of household chores, which was very helpful since she had never done anything of the kind before. Mr. Gurdjieff came to live quite near us at his cousin's. Again, it was as if everything had been prepared in advance. The horses were now quartered quite far away, and I had to go every day to feed them. I had another task, too. Mr. Gurdjieff told me to unstitch the 2 big tents and take the blue striped canvas, which peasants like for trousers, to the marketplace. He told me to ask a very high price for it. This time I felt no hesitation or embarrassment, only fear that I might not be able to get a high price. I went to the market and saw that the best locations were already occupied. As I was a complete novice in such affairs, I spread the canvas on the grass at the edge of the marker and waited. Everyone passed by, and no one even glanced my way. Finally, one came over to me, then another. They looked at the canvas and left without even asking the price. Then they came back and asked, but they would not even listen when I told the price Mr. Gurdjieff wished me to ask. Perhaps it was too high, perhaps they pretended it was. I did not wish to sell for less, but as more people came and left, I finally decided to lower the price. At once one bought, then another, then a third, and even little pieces in corners were sold in about a minute. When I gave the money to Mr. Gurdjieff, he said, "You could not sell it for the proper amount," but I saw he was satisfied. The next day I had to sell a large, heavy tarpaulin. I put it on my shoulder and went to the middle of the marketplace. I was already an old hand. Mr. Gurdjieff told me to ask 500 rubles, a price that no one would consider, but finally a man in a bowler stopped and I quickly called to him to buy. He agreed, but asked that the tarpaulin he brought to his home. But asked that the He agreed, but asked that the tarpaulin be brought to his home. I put it on my shoulder and we started off. At that moment I heard someone call, "Hartmann, what are you doing here?" I looked up and saw the doctor who had cured me of typhoid a year earlier in the hospital here. We were very glad to see each other, to the great astonishment of the man in the bowler, who found out from the doctor who I was. He became quite friendly with us and later bought our 2 horses. My wife also had quite an experience at this time. Mr. Gurdjieff's cousin was in the final stage of consumption. Dr. S. was treating him, but, after staying up for several nights, he was tired, and Mr. Gurdjieff asked my wife whether she wished to stay one night with the sick man. She said she would, and it turned out to be his last night. He died while my wife lifted him to ease an attack of coughing. Until then she had never seen a man die, and she said she had the astonishing impression that a light had been switched off. A new life began for us in Sochi. I never again had to do anything as uncongenial as selling at the market. I now returned to music professionally, and my wife began to use her singing to earn money. These activities were very successful, so our musical fast had not been harmful. With Mr. Gurdjieff, neither fasting nor laboring lasted very long. It seemed that each phase would never be finished, but the end always came unexpectedly soon. It now appeared that Mr. Gurdjieff was very right in insisting that we take good clothing in our expedition sacks. Jay became acquainted with the director of the post office in Sochi, a great lover of music. In the post office was a very big concert hall with a large stage and a second-rate piano, which the director at once put at our disposal. In less than a month, Jay became our impresario and had posters printed to advertise a concert by my wife, but of course not using her real name. I started giving piano lessons to some very nice young girls who began to study seriously. During Christmas, Jay organized another concert, and so life began to be financially easier. Beautiful surroundings and warm weather contributed to the general well-being. During this time, Mr. Gurdjieff went almost every day to the Circassians Officers Club in the big hotel where he had stopped the first night. The club was not only for the officers, but also for rich merchants and wealthy people from Petrograd and Moscow who had escaped to the south. Every evening they played cards, which was then very fashionable, and Mr. Gurdjieff was an expert. But only later did I understand why he enjoyed card playing so much at that time. It enabled him to be up to date concerning all political events. The White Army was not far away. Fighting could start at any time in Sochi, and that would be the moment for Mr. Gurdjieff to leave in the direction of Tiflis, where the old regime still existed. The only means of reaching Tiflis at this time was by boat to Poti, and from there on by train. In the middle of January, when the weather was very cold and windy, and the sea very rough, Mr. Gurdjieff came and told us to pack all our things, so that on hearing the ship's whistle, we could be on the pier within 1 hour. The next day we heard it, but on account of a heavy storm, the ship was unable to dock. 2 days later, a whistle was heard again. It was still too rough for even little boats to come right to the shore, so we had to reach them by means of very narrow planks. On the ship itself, there was no comfort because it turned out to be very small and crowded with people and vermin. We stayed on the upper deck in the rain 1 whole night and day. Then it turned sunny and quite cold, with a headwind. It became very dangerous because delay meant that the fuel might not last. The captain was happy when we finally reached the pier at Poti. Although it was not far from Sochi, and south of it, there was a heavy frost. A driver at the pier asked a very high price to take us to the station, but we had to hire him. We stayed the night at the station because the train for Tiflis would not leave until the next morning. The station was unimaginably dirty and crowded with civilians and soldiers, but luckily one of the trainmen was very nice and allowed us to go into an empty car and spend the night there. At 8 the next morning, in terrible cold, we reached Tiflis. Mr. Gurdjieff was met by his relatives. My wife and I asked to be taken in an inexpensive hotel in the center of Tiflis. We knew that the prices at the Oriental Hotel, where we stayed several years ago, were prohibitive. Near the Opera House, there was an ordinary hotel, such as we never had thought we could endure. But the stove was lit and it was warm in the room. That was most important, as we both wore only summer coats, and we did not pay much attention to the iron beds and straw mattresses. We had to go out to buy something to eat. We found wonderful Caucasian apples and bread. That was our first supper in Tiflis. Next day I went to meet Mr. Gurdjieff, and on the way I ran into my old friend, the composer, Nicolas Cherepinin. He was as astonished as I was to meet on the streets in Tiflis. During this period, the old regime was still in control in Tiflis, and Cherepinin remained as director of the conservatory belonging to the Imperial Music Society. Learning that I had just arrived, he asked if I would consent to take the post of professor of composition. I was happy to do so, and within 2 days already had a large class. The Conservatory of Tiflis served the whole of the Caucasus, and 2,000 pupils were enrolled. In my composition class, there were 12 very talented young men, among them Cherepin's son, Alexander, who is now a very well-known composer. In general, Tiflis was a town of great culture. There was an opera house as large as the Opera Comique in Paris, a drama theater with a revolving stage, as well as Circassian and Armenian clubs with theatrical halls. In short, owing to Cherepinin, I at once found myself in the center of the artistic, theatrical, and cultural life of the city. Very soon the director of the State Opera suggested that I join the artistic committee of the theater, which was then planning a gala spectacle with a great singer from Petrograd as Carmen. Cherepinin was also the conductor of the Opera House Orchestra, and proposed that my wife, though she had never sung in a theater, sing Michaela, saying, "We will finally have a Michaela who really looks like a young girl." I asked who would design the scenery for this special performance, and was told that it would be done by a very great artist named Salzmann. This name at once awakened memories of my days in Munich, where I had studied conducting with Felix Mottl at the time, and Alexander von Salzmann had been a very well-known painter. I asked his full name, and, learning that it was this same painter, went to find him. From then on, we saw each other daily in the theater, but he never invited me to his home. Later, we found out that when he had spoken about us to his wife, she had said, "Bring him, but not his wife." Mr. de Salzmann had replied, "No, that is not possible. Ask both, or neither will come." At that time, I could not invite him to visit us, because we never invited anybody. Mr. Gurdjieff did not wish it. Some weeks later, Mr. de Salzmann asked us to come to his home. Madame de Salzmann was then expecting her first child, and did not go out. She taught the Dalcroze system of dancing, as everyone then had to earn a living, and held her classes in the hall of the military school, which was large and had a very good piano. She was planning to give a demonstration in the opera house, because the Dalcroze school in Tiflis was sponsored by the Circassian government. We began to see the Salzmanns quite frequently, and soon our conversation turned to the subject of Mr. Gurdjieff's teaching without any mention of his name. The question was raised of the necessity of a guide, a teacher, and we were able to say that we were fortunate enough to know such a man. When we saw the Salzmanns' sincere interest and eager desire to know who this man was, we spoke about them to Mr. Gurdjieff, and he permitted us to bring them to him. And so, at Easter time, we went with them to Mr. Gurdjieff. The conversation, as I vividly remember, was very interesting. After they had left, we asked Mr. Gurdjieff his impression, and he said, "He is a very fine man, and she is intelligent." Madame de Salzmann, having learned from us about the sacred dances in Essentuki, asked Mr. Gurdjieff to come to see the work of her pupils, so one day we went with Mr. Gurdjieff to her class. The pupils, all young pretty girls in Greek costumes, stood in a circle in the middle of a very big hall. Mr. Gurdjieff greeted them, watched with interest for for 5 or 10 minutes and left. Some days later he came again and at once ordered them, in a military tone, to straighten their lines, to dress left, to dress right. Then he put them all in one row in front of him and said, "Before beginning any work in sacred gymnastics, you must learn how to turn." He showed them how to turn in the military way. This turning became being accompanied by my chords on the piano. I was very surprised by all this. When we had arrived the first day in Essentuki, and Mr. and Mrs. Uspensky and the others had done this military turning, I had not been surprised. Here I could imagine the reactions of these young Dalcroze dancers, who must have dreamed only about graceful Greek dances, but to my further astonishment, all passed very smoothly and regular work with them started. The result was that Madame de Salzmann offered Mr. Gurdjieff a part of her demonstration to show his sacred gymnastics and sacred dancings. After the great success of the first demonstration, Mr. Gurdjieff decided to give another, but this time he wished to give everyone a very different experience. It would be a new demonstration, with none of the Dalcroze dances and nothing staged by Madame de Salzmann. The majority of the young girls were admirers of her and of Dalcroze and began to protest. In addition, since the girls were to take part in Mr. Gurdjieff's gymnastics, he told Madame de Salzmann to tell them they all would be paid a little. This was entirely too much for them. They all refused the money with disdain and began to protest seriously. It was a great worry to Madame de Salzmann how easy it would have been for her to slip away from the great aim of Mr. Gurdjieff's work in self-love and vanity. But here she was really wise. Not a hint of offense was visible. With the whole force of her authority and the feeling of the righteousness of Mr. Gurdjieff's work, she was able to persuade her pupils to take part in the new exercises, and the demonstration took place after intensive work. The theater was less than crowded. However, the aim was not to have many people, but rather to create conditions for a new experience, first of all, perhaps, for Madame de Salzmann herself. During this time, my wife and I were working very hard on our musical activities. We needed to become more widely known to attract more pupils and engagements. We had found a better room with some nice people who had a piano in their drawing room, which they put at my disposal. There I could practice and compose. I had to prepare a repertoire for chamber music, concerts, and coach my wife in singing for her forthcoming performances. I remember how, an hour and a half before one of these concerts, Mr. Gurdjieff had a lesson with Madame de Salzmann's girls, and I had to play for the gymnastics, not quite the usual thing for a concert artist. I even had to demonstrate for the girls some difficult exercises which we had had in Essentuki. One was to put all the weight of the body on the hands while the feet made very strong, rapid movements, and Mr. Gurdjieff stopped the class only half an hour before my concert in the town hall. The girls changed their dresses, and Mr. Gurdjieff, with Madame de Salzmann, taking all the girls along, went to the concert. The girls were very much impressed by a man who could do difficult gymnastic movements and then almost at once play a concert. I knew Mr. Gurdjieff wished to show how people working with him had to be able to function on different levels, so he made it as a kind of test for me. What kind of pianist was I? Soon my wife also was given a test when the time came for her to sing Michaela. It was very difficult because of her inexperience, but Mr. de Salzmann promised to show her how to make up, what to wear, how to arrange her long braids of hair. On the eve of the performance, she had quite a high temperature and was naturally nervous. Mr. Gurdjieff told her he would be at the back of the theater where she could see him. This gave her confidence, and she sang perfectly. Later, she gave several more performances. By this time, my teaching at the conservatory was going very well. Many private lessons had begun, and that made it possible for us to live more comfortably. For example, every day I now brought 2 dinners home from a restaurant instead of 1 as before. In the morning and in the evening, we ate cornbread and tea made from apples. The winter was cold, and we had only summer clothing, but we had faith that with Mr. Gurdjieff nothing too awful could happen. Nevertheless, the condition of my wife's health seemed far from improving, and Mr. de Salzmann took her to one of his Tiflis friends, a very good lung doctor. He told her she must go at once to a sanatorium. We certainly could not afford it, so Mr. Gurdjieff told her to have bacon every morning, to take red wine from a bottle he would give her, and, although the temperature was freezing, to lie every morning for 1 hour in the open air, very well covered with all the blankets we had. She fulfilled all he demanded, and during the rest of the day, life continued as always. In a month's time, Mr. de Salzman took her again to the same doctor. He was glad to see how her condition was, and was astonished that she had not gone away. He added that if he had not himself examined her 4 weeks before, he would not have believed that she could have been so ill. My activities began to widen. I wrote for newspapers in my first article concerning an Armenian composer, Komitas, about whom I wrote a biography and a critical analysis of his choral music and his compositions for solo voices. Later, I gave lectures about him as an introduction to concerts of his music. My wife learned his songs in Armenian and took part in these concerts. The Armenians themselves did not know what a wonderful composer they had and did not realize the place he held in their culture. In addition to the Armenian music, the Circassians asked me to work on their music, which I did for 2 or 3 hours a day. Practically every evening we had supper with the director of the opera house and with Mr. de Salzman and a specialist in their music. There was much conversation about the next season, when I was to conduct several performances, and our friendly relations with the director of the theater were strengthened. One day Mr. Gurdjieff's brother arrived unexpectedly. He had remained in Essentuki when we had left for the trip through the mountains. In the basement of his house we had hidden our 6 big trunks filled with the belongings we had brought with us from Petrograd, because we feared they would be taken by the Germans. He now brought the news that the White Army had discovered the trunks, though carefully concealed beneath piles of stove wood, and, thinking that they were stolen goods hidden by the Bolsheviks, had confiscated them. The priceless antique porcelain had been smashed by the soldiers, the linen distributed to this hospitals, and the furs divided among the officers. It was only when they came to a trunk containing my manuscript music with my name on it that the officer in command realized that the contents of the trunks actually belonged to a well-known composer and guards officer. He ordered the remaining belongings to be taken to his own home. Unhappily, what was left consisted only of some furs, my manuscripts with Persian miniatures between the pages, some family miniatures, and a number of articles of little value. The officer told Mr. Gurdjieff's brother that the owner could come and claim his property when he wished. Mr. Gurdjieff decided that someone had to go to Essentuki to get what was left of our things, and also to try to find some carpets he had stored there. A man could not go, because he would certainly be seized by either the White or the Red Army. It had to be one of our women, and Mr. Gurdjieff decided that my wife was the only one who would be able to accomplish such a task. The following is an account of the trip in her words. When Mr. Gurdjieff asked me to go, I was filled with terror, because never in my life had I even walked in the street alone. Before my marriage, custom demanded that I always be accompanied by someone. Afterwards, my husband was with me. Now I had to undertake, for these relatively insignificant things, a dangerous journey in absolutely unknown conditions. It was impossible to go directly to Essentuki through the Caucasian mountains, since the war had closed all roads. I had to take the train from Tiflis to Batum, then the boat to Novorossiysk, and finally the train to Essentuki. The return journey had to be made by the same route. What kind of accommodations, if any, would be available in wartime? Preparations were made for my adventure. Friends gave me letters of introduction, one to their great friend Lewandowski in Batum, whose son was an officer in the regiment there, and the second to the manager of the best hotel. Mr. Gurdjieff knew that paper money differed from district to district, so he gave me some gold coins, which I sewed inside my belt. In addition, he gave me a mysterious little box, in which he said there was a special pill, and I could take in case of extreme necessity. But, he said, he would be very pleased if I could bring it back to him untouched. The decision to accept this challenge was a very difficult one for my husband and me to make. I accepted it, but I confess that there was also a feeling of pride and vanity, not to show fear, and to be able to rise to this challenge. Next day, I took the overnight train to Batum. Travel on the railway was terrible, women and men together in crowded compartments. I cried all night through, but luckily I couldn't even imagine what lay ahead. I reached Batum the next morning and went at once to the hotel with my letter of introduction. The owner was not there. I spoke with his son, who said that he was very sorry there were no rooms at all, and that putting a bed in a sitting room or dining room was out of the question, since they would all be filled with camp beds for men. However, he suggested that I return later when his father would be in. Leaving my little suitcase at the hotel, I went with my other letter of introduction to find the Lewandowskis, but they had moved away without leaving any address. So here I was in a strange city without a friend and without even knowing where I was going to sleep for the night. I went to get information about boat passage to Novorossiysk, and I found that the first possibility was a poor old boat which would sail in 2 days. The captain, an old man with a long beard, said there were no cabins and that he would not permit me to go down in the hold with the men, who were Oriental tradesmen and salesmen. His only suggestion was that I sleep on a bench in the dining room. Bravely, I bought my ticket, and then he told me I would need a visa. The English were occupying Batum at this time. When I went to get my visa for the trip to Novorossiysk and back again, the young officer said he could give me a visa only for the trip to Batum, from Batum to Novorossiysk. Feeling uncertain, I did not wish to trust the young officer, and asked to speak to the senior one. After great discussion, I persuaded the commander of the English forces to give me a return permit, which he wrote on a small scrap of paper. Paper was very scarce during wartime. I keep it still as a souvenir. Happy to have succeeded with the visa, I went back to the hotel. The owner had not yet returned, and I again asked his son if some place could be found for me. He gave me the same answer as before. I was in despair. Then an idea struck him, and he said that he and his friend lived in a little two-room cottage in his father's garden, and that the two could share one room, leaving me the other. I accepted this arrangement at once with relief and naivety, and we went to see the little cottage, which was very nice, deep in the garden, surrounded with beautiful trees. I was delighted. We left my little suitcase there, and I went to look for a place to eat. On the street, I unexpectedly met a singer and his wife, whom my husband and I had known slightly in Tiflis. They were astonished to see me there alone, and, having learned about my garden arrangement, thought it very unwise, and asked me to stay with them in their hotel room, sleeping on their mattress, which they proposed to put on the floor for me. However, I felt that the boys were quite nice and preferred to have a room to myself rather than to sleep on the floor and embarrass people whom I knew so slightly. So these friends said they would take me out for dinner and then take me to the cottage to show the boys that I was not without friends in town. We returned to the cottage early, and they left me saying they would come to see me in the morning. I began to unpack and install myself, and it was only then that I noticed that there was no lock on the door. I wedged a heavy chair against it and slept like a stone. In the morning, I was awakened by a noise like a locomotive going by, but I found that it was the boys preparing coffee on a Primus stove for me. They had already bought some bread and a little milk. They were so nice and thoughtful that I will never forget them. I went back to town, hoping to find a police station where I could inquire about the Lewandowskis. On the way, I met an officer, stopped him, and asked where the regimental headquarters were located. He, in return, asked me whom was I looking for in the regiment, and when I replied, "Lieutenant Lewandowski," he answered, "But I am Lewandowski." It was too amazing. He at once took me to his parents, with whom I stayed until my boat left 2 days later. All my new friends came to see me off, and I felt they were very anxious about my journey. The boat sailed in the evening, and I sat on the deck, but soon the weather became very rough, and the captain said I should take his cabin, as I could not remain on the deck. He assured me he would be outside on watch all through the night, since a heavy storm was approaching. Feeling relieved and even happy at having a bed to sleep on, I fell asleep, but in the middle of the night I woke to find the boat rolling alarmingly in the heavy sea. The captain's coat, hanging against the wall over my head, was swinging like a pendulum. I held in my hand the mysterious little box, thinking that I would use the pill only if the ship went down. The tempest was raging. There was terrible lightning and thunder, and it was my first sea voyage, but, nevertheless, I finally fell asleep, and in the morning awoke to find the captain asleep at the other end of the same couch. Later he told me that the storm had been so severe he had been forced to steer a course towards Trabzon in Turkey, opposite to the direction of our destination, and that this meant we would be another night at sea. I knew that the captain would be too tired to sit up another night, so I decided on one of the benches in the dining salon, where we took our meals. Unfortunately, a Greek passenger also decided to sleep on one of the other benches, and, during the night, he awoke me and wanted to start conversation. I quickly jumped up and went to the captain's cabin and sat near his door, where I would be safe without awakening him. The Greek followed me, but, knowing that I would awaken the captain if he bothered me, he disappeared. It was evening when we at last reached Novorossiysk, and I went at once to the house of one of Mr. Gurdjieff's pupils, Jokoff, who had made the big trip through the mountains with us. He was delighted to see me and at once arranged his dining room for me, putting his bed there. He had to sleep on the floor in his bedroom. I told him why I had come, and we took the first train to Essentuki, as he did not wish me to go alone. In Essentuki, I looked first of all for Mr. and Mrs. O, and on entering their house, I saw Mr. O walking back and forth, carrying in his arms a little baby who was crying lustily. It was Linia Savitsky, the son of Madame O's daughter. Then I went to see the commandant of the White Army to ask about our belongings. He said he was very sorry that almost everything had been taken before it was known that they belonged to us. I told him that I regretted only the old family miniatures, which were quite irreplaceable. He asked what they were like and brought some miniatures from his room, saying he had preserved them as they were so beautiful. They were ours, and I recovered them with great happiness. In the trunks I found only valueless things, except for a good astrakhan coat and some manuscripts of my husband's music, which were not important because they had already been printed. But among the pages there were 8 beautiful old Persian miniatures, which were quite priceless. So, from the 6 trunks I collected just one bundle of valuables, but a small suitcase, which I particularly hoped to find, was not there at all. Then I went with Jokoff to look for Mr. Gurdjieff's carpets at a special place where many were displayed for people to claim. I was able to identify 2, a small one and a large one. The guard said that those were already claimed, and if I wished to dispute it, I would have to bring another witness. Fortunately, Jokoff was there, and he provided the required testimony, so I was able to bring back to Mr. Gurdjieff 2 antique carpets. Jokoff and I returned at once to Novorossiysk, and I began to look for a ship to return to Batum. I was told that there hadn't been one for 6 months, and that no visas were being given. I was frantic, since everybody said it was useless even to try. I found some sailors who said they would take me to Batum for a certain amount of money, but Jokoff forbade me this adventure. However, I continued to search for a boat, and 2 days later happened to see on the street a very small announcement which said that a transport company had a boat leaving the next day at 6 in the morning. I rushed to the indicated office and asked for passage. They told me that it was quite impossible, as one had to have a visa and the price of the ticket in gold. I said I have both. They would not believe me, saying that the English were giving permission to no one. I insisted that I would bring both the visa and the gold at once. They agreed to wait only 10 minutes, no more, as they closed the office at noon. I went outside and on a street corner took off my belt, in which I had sewn the gold coins and the visa, and re-entered the office triumphantly. They sold me my ticket, and I ran home to Jokoff full of joy. Next morning at 6, with my bundles in a hired horse-drawn carriage, Jokoff and I arrived at the pier. There was a great crowd of black-bearded and dirty Greek and Armenian merchants, no women at all. Out of the Black Sea, an English warship was visible. Out in the Black Sea, an English warship was visible, and to my astonishment, I discovered this was to be my boat. An English officer came to verify the visas, and when he saw my visa and my passport, and found out that I was the wife of a guard's officer, he said that it was impossible for me to sail, since there were no cabins and no ladies could travel in the hold. I said I would be quite happy if they allowed me to stay on the deck, since I had to go no matter what. A little later, the officer came back and told me in no case to go down in the hold, but to stay on deck near the smokestack with my baggage. I said goodbye to Jokoff and went on board, taking my place on the deck. In a few minutes, a smart English steward approached me, took my bags, and led me to a cabin with 4 bunks. I asked, a little annoyed, who the other occupants were. He replied that the cabin was for me alone. He added that the tea would be served at once, and that in 2 hours he would bring me breakfast. There was even a bath in the cabin. At noon, an officer came and brought me an invitation from the captain to have meals at his table. I enjoyed wonderful food in the company of the captain and 12 officers. This, after all my hardships. In the evening, after dinner, we all sat in armchairs on the deck, the officers vying with each other to be entertaining and attentive. It was a beautiful, starry night, such a contrast to the trip from Batum. and I was even a little disappointed that the voyage was over so soon. In Batum, I again met by chance my new friends from Tiflis, and they could not believe that I was back from Essentuki within a week. I took the first train to Tiflis and was quickly home, to the delight of my husband, who had not expected me to return for some time. I gave Mr. Gurdjieff the two carpets and the little box with the pill in it. He was very pleased and said that the returned box was the best of all. For Mr. Gurdjieff, certainly, the carpets were not important, nor were our belongings to us. They were just a pretext to have me thrown alone into life, to see how I could manage in conditions far more difficult than anyone, even Mr. Gurdjieff, could imagine in advance. And most important of all was to see whether we both could accept such a task and deal with it. Soon Mr. Gurdjieff gave another task for both my wife and me. We were to go to Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, and give several concerts. Thanks to my reputation among the Armenians and to my articles about their composer Komitas, we were able to do this. During the winter, my wife had learned his songs in Armenian, so we had on hand an Armenian as well as a European repertoire. The trip itself by train presented many difficulties, as the war with the Turks had just ended. The retreating armies had almost destroyed the seats in the coaches. We had to sprinkle the floor with disinfectant to avoid lice and vermin, which could have carried typhus. The railway passed through places badly devastated as a result of the Turkish invasion. The Armenians were close to starvation. The president of the Armenian Republic told me that, only a month before, he himself had seen hundreds of people in the streets dying of starvation. However, by the time we arrived, American flour had come and there was no longer widespread famine. Even so, when we passed the marketplace, we saw several people sitting like corpses, homeless and starving, awaiting death. From the station to the town, it was a walk of a mile and a half, as there was no transportation. There were also no rooms in the hotels. Here again the wonderful Eastern hospitality came to our rescue. People whom we hardly knew helped us to find an apartment, which had just been vacated by some officers. The only furniture was an iron bed covered with planks. It was early June and very hot. Again, fearing vermin, we poured kerosene over the floor, the planks, and the bed. I had to sleep on the floor, and I drew a magic circle of kerosene around the place. My wife slept on the planks in spite of the kerosene. The vermin crawled up the walls to the ceiling and dropped on us. After a night on the train and a night in conditions like these, we had to prepare for a concert, typing announcements, visiting prominent people, and arranging other details. But all this was easy when I took it as a task that had to be carried out as well as possible. 3 concerts were announced, the first of European and Russian music, the second consisting of a lecture by me about Komitas and a recital of his songs in Armenian by my wife, the third a mixed program. As Armenia was at that time occupied by English forces, an English officer attended the second concert and came backstage to see us afterwards. He asked how we had reached Yerevan from Tiflis during such a time and said that, if we let him know when we were returning, he would arrange better accommodations for us. On the last day, we were invited to have tea and spend the evening with Archbishop Sarpazan Horin. His house was situated in the highest part of Yerevan, from which there was an almost vertical drop to the Zanga River. Beyond the green prairies, which stretched right to the horizon, there stood the 2 peaks of Mount Ararat, one very high, the other somewhat lower, illuminated by the rays of the setting sun. When night fell, a full moon shone through the warm southern air, and Mount Ararat was wrapped in a shroud of mist, an unforgettable sight. To accompany this vision, there was real Eastern music, because Sarpazan had also invited a relative of his, who was one of the best players of the tar, a kind of stringed instrument in Armenia. There were different kinds of bathi and gap in Eastern Rhapsody, consisting of music for song and dance. Through this trip to Yerevan, Mr. Gurdjieff gave us the opportunity of listening to real Eastern music and musicians, so that I could better understand how he wished his own music to be written and interpreted. To value such experiences, it was necessary to live with Mr. Gurdjieff, so that one could develop power of attention and take in these impressions strongly, without the distracting non-essential associations. For our return, the English officer had a special car attached to the train, in which we traveled very comfortably to Tiflis. During the summer, we went to spend a few weeks in Bornholm, where the theater from Tiflis had moved for the summer. It was a mountain resort of unusual beauty, about 10 hours by train from Tiflis, with famous springs of mineral waters like Vichy's. Mr. Gurdjieff also came there. Our life was absorbed with concerts, which I conducted, and at which my wife sometimes sang. One day, Mr. Gurdjieff brought his overcoat to my wife, showing her that, although the outside was badly worn and faded, the inside was fine. At that time, nothing could be bought in Russia. Could she turn the coat inside out? My wife was quite uncertain, never having sewn anything, and fearing that if she tried to do it, Mr. Gurdjieff would have no coat at all. But he said it was very easy. One just takes the white thread to mark the seams before undoing them. Then one rips it open, ironing as one goes along, ironing out the old folds and ironing in the new. The whole secret of good sewing is the careful following of the white thread and the ironing, he insisted, and all this had to be done by hand and with an iron heated on a Primus stove. With great difficulty, my wife finally finished it, and Mr. Gurdjieff wore it for many, many years. He often said, "If you know how to do one thing well, you can do everything." Everyone returned to Tiflis in the autumn. There, Mr. Gurdjieff started a center of work like that in Essentuki, but corresponding to the conditions of life in Tiflis. It began on the terrace of the house where we lived, because the weather was still hot. There were Dr. S., the two Salzmans, and we two. Mr. Gurdjieff briefly explained the ideas of the institute he wished to organize there. He told about the aim and the methods of the work and the day when we hoped to open the institute. Then he asked us, "What name would you give such an institute?" We tried to think of a name that would connect with all that Mr. Gurdjieff had just told us. He rejected every suggestion. Finally, as if we had been squeezing our brains like a tube of toothpaste, the word harmonious came out. Afterwards, it was clear to me that Mr. Gurdjieff had decided on this name some time earlier, but instead of giving us a ready-made word, he forced us to look for it, pushed us, tried to bring us closer to the main thought, till this word emerged. Finally, we had the name of the institute that Mr. Gurdjieff wanted. It was the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. A large room was found. Mr. Gurdjieff bought a piano. Not a good one, he said. Anyone can play on a good one. Gymnastics started again, beginning with the obligatory exercises, which I also did when I was not needed to play the piano. The first, based on simple movements, became very complicated, with arms, legs, and head having their own sequence, and with repetitions in canon. I knew all the exercises very well, but to do them wasn't easy. I came to recognize that I couldn't do them with only theoretical knowledge. To do these exercises properly demanded a lot of energy and concentrated attention. In the beginning, like a naive child, I wondered when we would have esoteric exercises from Tibetan monasteries. I had to learn that the value of an exercise does not lie in the knowledge of its source, but in what one experiences in doing it. Soon the room where we did the gymnastics became too small because more people joined us. The Circassian government had promised to find Mr. Gurdjieff a good house, but had failed to do so. However, Mr. Gurdjieff never wasted time. Now, sitting in the room which the director of the opera house had given him, he began to dictate to one of us the text of The Struggle of the Magicians. In the evenings, we even worked on the staging of The Struggle of the Magicians, in which the same pupils made the beautiful movements of the white magician as well as the ugly movements of the black magician. As to my own personal life, Mr. Gurdjieff told me now to give up music, lessons, conservatory, everything. I saw very clearly that I should not and could not fulfill this demand because it would leave me entirely without money. So I answered that whenever I was needed for the work, I would be available, and nothing would interfere with that. But as for the rest of my time, I would do whatever I considered necessary. Of course, my work in the theater had to be given up, since it would have occupied the whole day. By teaching in the conservatory and by private music lessons, which were over at 7 o'clock, and Mr. Gurdjieff never needed me before 8, I could earn my living and at the same time maintain my position as a composer. We never knew what would happen later on. To have given up everything would not have been right. I remember that Mr. Gurdjieff once said to me, "If I told you to masturbate, would you listen to me?" The future showed that I was right in my decision. Work continued, but the house for the Institute, promised by the government, still remained no more than a promise. Mr. Gurdjieff declared that he would end his work in Tiflis. Hearing that, Mr. de Salzman became very energetic. He knew how to deal with high government officials and drew a cartoon for this satirical Circassian magazine called The Devil's Whip, and very soon the cartoon appeared on its pages. It showed the main square of Tiflis, called Yerevan Place, with all kinds of furniture and dishes and pots and pans thrown together around an old stove, and in the middle Mr. Gurdjieff, surrounded by his pupils, all bundled up in their coats. The caption read, "They have finally moved." This made such an impression on the city officials that they gave us a 2-story house across the river with a large ground-floor hall. The next problem was to furnish the house. First of all, we had to prepare the hall for gymnastics. We had a piano, but we needed something for all the people to sit on. So several of us went to a lumber yard to get wood for benches. Somewhere Mr. Gurdjieff got a hammer, a rasp, and a saw, and the carpentry began. Mr. Gurdjieff worked on everything himself and proved to be an expert carpenter. Benches for 50 to 60 people were made, painted, and placed around the walls. These also provided seats when there were lectures. All this was accomplished in a very short time. Mr. Gurdjieff moved into the house itself and insisted that Mr. and Madame de Salzman, with their little daughter, should occupy one of the rooms. It was the same thing he had done with us in Essentuki. At 8 o'clock every evening, except Saturday and Sunday, gymnastics began. 1 hour earlier, the samovar was heated so the pupils could have a cup of tea with sugar and a little sweet bread. We, however, could not permit ourselves this treat, since Mr. Gurdjieff charged a very high price for it, the same price charged by the only remaining cafe in Tiflis. He did this to see who would permit himself such a luxury, but at the same time the money helped to support the Institute. Several times the Circassian State Theater sent about 50 of its pupils to study our exercises. These people were not of the intelligentsia, but were nice, simple young men dreaming of work in the theater. Mr. Gurdjieff gave them special, simple exercises. Revenue from our pupils did not cover expenses of the Institute, and no one had the time to earn extra money. So on Christmas Eve, Mr. Gurdjieff invited only Mr. and Madame de Salzman and my wife and myself to spend the evening with him. He ordered the traditional rice pudding made with honey and dried fruit and a few other traditional Christmas things. The supper was thin and poor, and we had it in a cold, bare room. But since Mr. Gurdjieff was with us, it was, as always, more than enough. We would not have exchanged this evening for another full of abundance and comfort. Ever since early autumn, I had been quite anxious about starting intensive work on The Struggle of the Magicians. All my stage experience indicated that it was necessary to work much faster than we were working if the performance was to be given in the spring. Mr. Gurdjieff had said, "Write the music as you wish for the first act," and so, naturally, I did. Returning one evening after supper, he finally, on my insistent request, began to whistle the music for the second act, which I tried feverishly to write in shorthand on music paper. Of course, I knew from experience that when Mr. Gurdjieff began to stage The Struggle of the Magicians, all would probably be changed. Mr. Gurdjieff had Mr. de Salzman design the stage set for Act 1 with a picture of Mr. Gurdjieff himself in it. There was also a design for Act 2. All kinds of materials were needed for the stage set, so Mr. Gurdjieff bought an old upright piano. I was at first afraid I would have to play on it, but he quickly pacified me by saying that there were lots of materials in it for the sets: strings, woods, nails, screws, and so on. Among other things for the stage, Mr. Gurdjieff made a doll of papier-mâché with little lights shining through tiny holes. The brilliance of the lights was controlled by a rheostat, also made by Mr. Gurdjieff. One evening he showed us how the light dimmed or brightened at will. It was wonderfully effective. Next morning my wife came into the dining room to find Mr. Gurdjieff smashing the doll with an axe. She looked on him with horror, not knowing what to think, but he said, "We have made it, so we do not need it any more." When Mr. Gurdjieff announced that the struggle of the magicians would be performed in the State Theater, it seemed to me like a joke, since we did not even have material for costumes. But if he had not said this, we would not have worked with the intensity he wanted. The struggle of the magicians was a disguise for real work. We were probably not at this time advanced enough for work with Mr. Gurdjieff to be our only aim. We still had to have an outer attraction, such as a public performance. Later in the spring, the Institute gradually dissolved. It became clear that Mr. Gurdjieff was finishing a period of his work. In fact, he was thinking about another move. He began to act coldly towards me, and it seemed that he didn't like my work with the Moscow Art Theater. I had just finished the music commissioned by this theater for one of Knut Hamsun's plays, and also the music for Rabindranath Tagore's play, The King of the Dark Chamber. He said that this theater did not understand the right methods, that in fact it contradicted the idea of a real theater. Nevertheless, in order to stay with Mr. Gurdjieff, I had to earn money. My music for the two plays was very well received, especially by the artists in the theater, and this success was the reward for my perseverance. One summer night, near the Tiflis Theater, I met Mr. Gurdjieff, and he advised me, without giving any reason, to make immediate preparations to go to Constantinople. But how would we find the means to go and live there? I had received a very large sum of money in advance from B., one of the composers in the theater, for orchestrating his music. His son is now a very famous choreographer in Paris. Now I had to repay him this money, as I would not have time to finish the work. Fortunately, my wife had not given to Mr. Gurdjieff her astrakhan coat, which she had once wished to cut up to make little Caucasian hats. Instead, she had sold this coat for a very good sum, and had kept the money hidden, not only from Mr. Gurdjieff, but also from me. Our friends from Tiflis, T&M, knowing we planned to leave, decided to have a farewell concert of my compositions in the hall belonging to a well-known Persian and built by a Persian architect. The hall had many slender columns decorated with tiny mirrors, and our two friends, understanding this kind of art, would not allow electricity to be used, but instead brought tall candles. The myriad reflections in the tiny mirrors gave a very beautiful effect. The piano was covered by a magnificent Persian shawl. The music was illuminated by two large candles entwined with Persian flowers. Instead of chairs, there were benches covered with Persian rugs. My wife, in a very good tenor of the Imperial Theater of Tiflis, sang, and I was at the piano. Mr. Gurdjieff was there and was satisfied, although the whole staff of the Moscow Art Theater was also there. Some days later he told me, to my great relief, that he was going with us to Constantinople. The money my wife got for the coat paid for our tickets and a part of Mr. Gurdjieff's. In a week we went to Batum and wrote to Constantinople. When our Armenian friends heard of this trip, they asked us to give a concert of Komitas's music in Batum, and this also brought us money. In Batum I had a quite unexpected joy. My wife went to buy our tickets for Constantinople, and as they had to be ordered, she gave our names and our address. After she returned home, a messenger from the ticket office came asking our Christian names, and 5 minutes later, to my great surprise, my sister appeared. She was earning her living as head of the ticket office in Batum. The head of the firm was also a Russian friend of ours. The last day, he asked us to take a large sum of money to Constantinople for him, as it could not be legally transferred or taken out of the country. Some days later, the ship sailed, and we left Russia, not suspecting that it would be forever. But Mr. Gurdjieff was with us. The Bolsheviks had already begun to enter the Caucasus, so we left just in time. The sea was calm, so different from our trip from Sochi to Poti. At the beginning of the voyage, all of us had to sleep on the deck, since we could not afford staterooms, but the captain gave Mr. Gurdjieff some screens for privacy, and let my wife and me have his working cabin at night because we gave a concert on the boat. So we were quite comfortable for 3 nights. But when we learned that we would probably have to be searched and quarantined on another ship before landing at Constantinople, we became greatly worried about the large sum of money we were carrying. My wife told the captain about the money, and we escaped quarantine completely by remaining locked in the captain's cabin, while all the other passengers, including Mr. Gurdjieff, underwent the quarantine inspection. On a sunny morning, we sailed into the harbor of the most beautiful city in the world, Constantinople. The captain allowed us to use his cabin for several nights until we found a place to live. We went up to Pira, the European part of the city, by cable car. At each station of this railway, there stood a Turk selling orange juice, which we drank with great pleasure. In a Greek shop, we ate meat cakes with Mr. Gurdjieff. All seemed wonderful after the stringent life in Tiflis. Here the markets were full of all kinds of food, and we were impressed by the rich life of the Turks and the occupation forces. In Russia, General Kolchat was defeated, and General Wrangel evacuated the remaining White Russian army from the Crimea to Constantinople. On our arrival, we had only 8 Turkish lira in our pockets, but we were sure of lucky accidents, and once again we soon learned how to earn a living. Walking through the streets, we saw a sign for a small room to rent. We found that it was owned by a nice Belgian widow and her son. When we told her we had only 8 lira to pay on account and that we would sell some jewels the next day to pay the rest, she told us to try to find work first, thus perhaps avoiding the sale of the jewels. We were lucky again. The room was small but very clean and in the center of the Pira. On the day after our arrival, we found that Mr. and Madame Uspensky were living in Principo, half an hour away by boat from the city. Mr. Uspensky had been going daily to the YMCA, where he had organized lectures concerning the spiritual development of man, and which had attracted a large audience. Mr. Uspensky had in fact prepared a group of pupils for an institute, but the opening of the institute did not take place until autumn. Meanwhile, Mr. Gurdjieff treated psychologically ill people who were brought to him, people who had been pronounced hopeless. Work started again on the struggle of the magicians, and I remember very vividly the evening when Mr. Gurdjieff dictated the song of the dervish for the first act. Uspensky describes it in Search of the Miraculous. 3 or 4 days later, we had another surprise. This time we found that my wife's sister was there in Constantinople with her family after having escaped from Russia. We had had no news of them since leaving Petrograd 2 years earlier. I became acquainted with the head of the YMCA, called the Lighthouse, a very nice American, and his Russian assistant, and they proposed that I give a daily lecture on music for 5 lira. $5. Soon concerts began at which my wife sang, and these also brought in money. Life became secure again. At the Lighthouse, I later met the stage director of the Imperial Theater in St. Petersburg. As my wife knew the leading soprano part of La Traviata, we considered giving the opera. At this time in Constantinople, there were many musicians who had escaped there from St. Petersburg. But there was no orchestral music, so it had to be played from piano scores, and almost by heart. I played the piano and at the same time conducted. Not long before, the Lighthouse had received a quantity of dark green cloth for clothing from the poor. Before it was cut up, we used it as curtains for the stage. The costumes were contemporary. We had seen La Traviata staged this way in Italy with Toscanini during the Verdi Centennial Festival. I remember that when the stage manager saw my wife at the dress rehearsal of La Traviata in her white dress, he was surprised and could hardly recognize her, having till that day seen her only in her poor ordinary clothes. All went perfectly, including the improvised orchestra under my baton. Half of the box office receipts went to the YMCA, and half of the musicians. Our share for the performance was $300. We were delighted. The following day, Mr. Gurdjieff advised us to use this money to go live in Principo, since my wife's health was not very good and she needed sun and rest. The pension there was the residence of a former pasha, and soon Mr. Gurdjieff himself came to live there. We had built up the performance of La Traviata from nothing to the point where it permitted me to have a good orchestra of 60 musicians with which I began to give bi-monthly concerts. As Turkish women could not attend the public concerts, we gave a special performance for them. My repertory consisted of works of the best Russian and French composers, as well as of Beethoven and Wagner, because I had the great luck to find all the necessary orchestral materials in the attic of the French consulate. Some time later, two French generals came to our room, which in spite of its smallness had a piano, a bed, and kitchen facilities, and invited me to give a concert of French music on Armistice Day with my orchestra and my wife as soloist. Mr. Gurdjieff began to plan the opening of the institute, as pupils had followed him from Tiflis. A house was soon found. On the first floor there was a large hall with benches. On the second, living rooms for Mr. Gurdjieff, and on the third, rooms for some of his pupils. A good upright piano was rented. Mr. Uspensky sent a group of tall young men who, with great enthusiasm, began to come every evening for gymnastics. Mr. Gurdjieff continued the exercises which he had given in Tiflis, but at the same time he added new ones. I saw that, as in Essentuki, the work was always on strengthening attention. Once, as I was watching and playing the piano as usual, Mr. Gurdjieff gave me a little piece of paper on which he had written in upper voice as an embellishment. It became impossible to play all the parts with two hands, so he told Madame de Salzmann to play the lower parts and me the upper part, and this became the dance of the dervishes. The more the pupils entered into the movement, the more exciting and beautiful it became, full of magical force characteristic of all orders of dervishes. It was very interesting to edit and rewrite the music of this dance. This had to be done at once according to Mr. Gurdjieff's instructions, which showed the main melody in the left hand 1/6 lower. Here it was amazing how the accompaniment, the little high voice, the lower sixth were blended to form a whole. Soon after that, Mr. Gurdjieff brought me another little piece of music paper in unusual flats in the key signature. The melody, over a monotonous beat in the bass, ran from beginning to end. This was the big dervish movement. When it was performed at the Champs-Élysées Theatre in Paris, Mr. Gurdjieff told some musicians in the orchestra to add a second voice, very soft, built on the same scale. This added tone was to represent the dervishes who were not active in the movement, but who, in a very low, monotonous voice, were saying their prayers. Now the whole thing became strikingly effective. Some time later, a pasha in his red fez met me and very politely told me that all the Turkish press was badly in need of money. Could I help by giving a concert with my orchestra? At once I promised to do all that I could without being paid, since I was a guest in Turkey. I told Mr. Gurdjieff about this, and he proposed a demonstration of Eastern dances and music. As it was a success, the demonstration was repeated several times in Constantinople, as well as in other places nearby. Some time later, the same pasha introduced Mr. Gurdjieff, my wife, and me to the sheikh of the Mosque of Pera, where on each Friday a service of whirling dervishes took place. After we had seen them several times, he invited Mr. Gurdjieff and me to an underground room of the mosque, where it was cool even on hot days, and where we sat on carpets drinking Turkish coffee, while the musicians who had just played for the dervishes gave a concert of the best Turkish music with flute and drum. I wished to take notes, but was told I could only listen, so I paid close attention, and as soon as I returned home, wrote down everything I could remember. The finest dervish musicians and experts of Turkish music all belonged to a monastic dervish order, Mevlevi, which permitted marriage. Our pasha belonged to this order. The Turkish music was as beautiful as the mosque itself, and left a profound impression. My wife could only listen and observe the dervishes from a high balcony and through a grill. Women at that time did not have the same rights as men. As in Tiflis, so now in Constantinople, Mr. Gurdjieff told me to give up my musical activities. In Tiflis, he had seemed glad that I did not actually do so, but this time conditions seemed to make it necessary, so I gave up my main conducting activities, which took so much time. To maintain our living, I gave only private lessons and private concerts, but owing to this decision, I was sometimes without any money at all. I remember vividly one day when my wife was ill, money was needed, and we had only a few small coins left. I decided to sell the vase given to me for the Armistice anniversary concert. The name and the price were still on the vase, 25 lira, but the shopkeeper did not wish to give a cent for it. A lady in the shop, one of the admirers of my concerts probably, proposed 2 lira, and I was glad to give the vase to her and buy what we urgently needed. I saw that fame is less than smoke, and for this realization I again thanked Mr. Gurdjieff. In the spring, Mr. Gurdjieff made our hall into a sort of theater so that the movements could be performed on the stage. He also began work on all kinds of supernatural phenomena, hypnotism, action at a distance, thought transference, etc. But he only started this program here. It was developed later at the Priory in France. At its proper place I will explain and describe its meaning. Now I will say only that it demanded from the pupils a maximum of attention and a quick comprehension, and had its fundamental purpose in Mr. Gurdjieff's general work of development. One day, when none of us had any money, we all came to the hall and discussed with Mr. Gurdjieff what was to be done. My wife offered to cable her brother in New York to send some money, as he owed me a large sum, and in a few days $300 arrived. We immediately brought it to Mr. Gurdjieff, who was very glad. We thought first of all of paying the rent of the institute. He gave us back enough to pay our own rent and to live on for a little while. Soon he began to think about leaving Constantinople and going to Berlin, because life in Constantinople had begun to deteriorate very rapidly. We gave a farewell concert, which brought in a good deal of money, enough for the tickets as well as for living in Berlin a whole year. On the last day, Mr. Gurdjieff played a trick on me which I must record. He said to me, "Toma, no money. You had a concert a day ago." My wife, knowing the difference between the voice of Mr. Gurdjieff when he really needed money and when he did not, would never have given him any, but I did. When we were about to board the freight car for Belgrade, a hamal porter, that is a porter, brought a sack of bear meat to Mr. Gurdjieff, who said, "Thank you, Toma. Owing to you, I could buy this meat for our trip." But then, smelling it, he threw it away. Once more, I saw that the work of Mr. Gurdjieff was a constant, beneficial playing with us to bring us to a right and active understanding. We started off for Berlin with Mr. Gurdjieff and his wife, and my wife's sister's family. In our freight car, we had to sit and sleep on the floor. We arrived at Sofia the second evening. We spent the night in a forest on the slope of a mountain near the railroad tracks. The next morning, we continued on our way in the same freight car and reached Belgrade in the evening. Tired from the 2 days and night on the floor of the freight car, we hoped to find a hotel in Belgrade, but instead, when we wished to get out of the train, the railway police began shouting at us, "Russian, go away. Entrance to Belgrade is prohibited. Go elsewhere." But a friend of ours, who was now the Russian consul, and to whom we had written, met us at the station and solved our difficulties. The next morning we were able to change to a second-class German coach, as clean and comfortable as before the war. We reached Budapest in the evening and spent the following day there. In the morning, Mr. Gurdjieff again gave me a difficult time. I naturally hoped that we would go into the center of the town, to the famous Wiener Cafe, and to the museum, but nothing of the kind took place. Mr. Gurdjieff strolled along the streets, stopped near a shop, and began to look at needles and bobbins on display in the windows. I was boiling inside, quite identified with my own plans. At the German frontier, we were quite astonished when the customs officers, learning that we were Russians, were very pleasant and didn't even open our luggage. When I think about our stay in Berlin, where we remained from the spring of 1921 until July 13th, 1922, I see that it was in fact a preparation for the move to France, where Mr. Gurdjieff finally realized his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man on a large scale. I am sure that when we arrived in Berlin, even Mr. Gurdjieff did not know what would occur there and in which directions we would have to turn our efforts. He always waited for the right moment for the next step. A hall was hired where work began on gymnastics with everyone who had followed us from Constantinople. Mr. Gurdjieff told us to learn English in our spare moments under the supervision of Mr. F. I also began to study English, but on my own. My wife had spoken it from childhood. Soon Mr. Gurdjieff himself began to study. As my wife now became Mr. Gurdjieff's secretary, and as she spoke 5 European languages, she spent much time in the cafe where Mr. Gurdjieff passed the greater part of his day, and she had to translate into English what he wrote in Russian. He related his words by choosing a particular subject to talk about, such as sewing or another trade or ordinary conversations. To check himself and me, he gave me a list of Russian words to translate into English. Then he translated them back into Russian. We wondered why Mr. Gurdjieff told us to study English, but soon the reason became clear. Mr. Uspensky, still in Constantinople, received the unexpected news that his book, Tertium Organum, had been translated into English and published with great success in both England and the United States. He was now able to go to London, where he at once organized a circle of people headed by Orage, the editor of The New Age, and began to give lectures dictated to the exposition of Mr. Gurdjieff's ideas. The circle grew very quickly, and those who attended these lectures asked to be put in touch with Mr. Gurdjieff personally. As a result, Mr. Gurdjieff made a trip to London, accompanied by my wife, as he could not yet speak either English or French. It was then decided to organize an institute in France, with funds coming from England. Back in Berlin, Mr. Gurdjieff made numerous purchases that puzzled us. Probably all the details of the organization of the institute were already foreseen in his mind, just as when we had prepared for our expedition through the mountains. The work on gymnastics continued without interruption until Mr. Gurdjieff and some of the pupils left by train for Paris on July 13th. We arrived in Paris on July 14th, 1922, during the noisy and joyful celebration of the French national holiday.